They breed in New York City in small numbers in some of the parks, Prospect Park or Greenwood Cemetery or some other of the cemeteries on the Queens Brooklyn border, like near Ridgewood, Bushwick area. And you often see big flocks of grackles. Like sometimes outside my window in Central Park, I'll see 200 grackles in a big flock flying around.
Hey, this is Epicenter NYC. We connect our communities to news, information, and each other. I'm your host, Amber Castillo. Not too long ago, my mother and I were heading home after a daily trek through Forest Park with our golden shepherd, Game Boy. Game Boy is typically the wildest provocateur of any wildlife encounters we'd had. But on this particular day, after turning onto our street off Park Lane South, we saw a swarm of black-colored birds, hundreds of them in the sky trees, power lines, on rooftops and lawns, and on sidewalks across the street. Fascinated by the superflock, I went down my deepest rabbit hole over birds to date. I finally consulted a couple bird experts sharing pictures and a video. Paul Sweet, a collection manager at the American Museum of Natural History's Department of Ornithology, was one of the experts who confirmed that these weren't crows, but common grackles. Today, I talk with Sweet, a Brooklyn resident who first gravitated towards birdwatching as a teen in the UK, who has worked at the museum for 32 years. Throughout his tenure, one of the most common misconceptions he's heard is the one I brought up. He also said that though the sheer volume was an uncommon sight on our streets, it was less so than I thought. Let's jump in. First, I wanted to ask you about you and how you got into this field.
Well, I grew up in England and UK, and I was interested in nature as a kid. Caught frogs and butterflies and newts and birds, feathers and fossils. So I had my own little natural history museum in my bedroom when I was a little boy. So and I became quite kind of enthusiastic about bird watching when I was a teen, and at university I studied biology. So just kind of led from there.
What's been your most impressive spot or site?
It's really hard to say. I mean, with my job here at the museum, I've traveled all over the world. So I've been to some really cool places and seen some great stuff. I think seeing birds of paradise in Papua New Guinea was one of the highlights, probably. And
what about in New York?
In New York, I'm always chasing the rare ones to see, if I could, new things for New York City.
What are considered rare birds in New York City?
Anything that hasn't been seen here before, I guess. I mean, right now on Randall's Island, there's a hummingbird called a black-chinned hummingbird. This is the first time that species has been seen in New York State.
Where are they usually?
They're usually out in the western United States.
Okay.
So some of what happens especially in the fall, it's a lot of the birds that are from the west. They're trying to migrate south, and they kind of get off course, and they end up coming to the East Coast.
And the common grackle, that's common for New York?
Oh, yeah. They breed in New York City in small numbers in some of the parks, Prospect Park or Greenwood Cemetery or some other of the cemeteries on the Queens Brooklyn border, like near Ridgewood, Bushwick area. And you often see big flocks of grackles in the winter. Like sometimes outside my window in Central Park, I'll see 200 grackles in a big flock flying around because they eat acorns from the oak trees. So wherever there's oak trees with acorns, they roam around looking for the acorns on the ground. They have a special way of eating acorns.
What's their special way?
They have almost a part of their beak is kind of cuts into the acorn and allows them to get the edible part from inside.
So
when I saw those ones in that picture, I bet on that street there were some oak trees, right? And then they were down on the ground eating the acorns.
Are there any other kinds of birds where we'll see these large numbers altogether?
In New York City, that's the tip. That's the one that you often see these very big flocks. Out in some areas, you can see big flocks of crows.
In the city?
Yeah, near the coast, you get big flocks of this birds called fish crows. Around Jamaica Bay, particularly around Shirley Chisholm Park and places like that, you can often see large groups of those. Maybe some of them leave during the winter, but yeah, they're mostly year round. Yeah.
I know you've been doing this since you were a kid, but do you have any tips for someone just getting into bird watching and maybe doesn't have large quantity of time or money to spend?
You don't really need much money. You can get a pair of binoculars for not that much money, a starter pair. There are lots of organizations in New York that organize bird walks. There's the Brooklyn Bird Club, the Queens Bird Club, the Linnean Society, New York City Audubon. All of those groups have usually free bird walks for birders. And there's even a young birders group if it's for young people.
What about without binoculars? Is there much?
You can see birds without binoculars, but it's harder to identify them if you don't have binoculars because, some of them are quite small and hard to distinguish the characteristics of them. So you can bird without binoculars, but it's really, not going to be great because you're going to be, I can't really see what that bird looks like, so.
Are there any trends you've noticed, like in recent years? I'm wondering anything with the climate crisis.
I haven't noticed anything myself that I could pin down to climate change. I mean, there certainly have been documented changes over the last century or so of certain species of birds moving northwards, possibly because of climate change, possibly because of changes in the habitat, like the removal of forests and the changing of habitat into suburbs or into agricultural land that mean that certain birds could move northwards.
Any birds in particular?
Birds like cardinals, which are quite common here now. Were not as common 100 years ago. Tufted titmice, red-bellied woodpeckers, mockingbirds, Carolina wrens. Those are all species that have kind of expanded their range northwards. Recently, we've been getting birds up, like we had our first anhinga in Brooklyn recently, which is like a bird that you usually see down in Florida. Other birds that we've seen up here recently are limpkins. After the hurricane this fall, there were flamingos all over the northeast. There were flamingos in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I guess that's climate related changes, but that's a more immediate result rather than long-term trend.
Right. And with these cardinals and other birds that previously weren't as common in New York, what do you feel or think about that, the kind of changing bird landscape?
I mean, I don't think I have any particular feelings about it. I mean, it's just a phenomenon that we're observing. I don't, I think that the problem is if the climate is getting warmer and things are moving north, they also, if you think about, say, mountains. So like if you have a mountain and there's this kind of bird that only lives on a certain height on a mountain because they like a particular habitat. Yeah. If the climate warms, that habitat zone is going to move higher. So at some point, you're going to run out of habitat and those birds will then go extinct. This is something we're worried about in places like the Catskill Mountains, where there are a few species of birds that are in New York State are only found right on the very tops of the highest mountains. So if the climate changes by a little bit and the trees up there, the lower elevation trees are able to move higher because birds are very, very tied to habitat, right? They can't just live anywhere. Certain birds live in certain kinds of trees or certain kind of grasslands or certain kind of marshes. So if their habitat is destroyed, then they won't be able to live there. Another example is like out on the coasts. So there's a bird called a salt marsh sparrow. They only really live in the salt marshes, which is this habitat, on the edge of the land. Mm-hmm. Probably recognize a salt marsh. It's like usually just open, grassy areas. So those birds nest in those marshes. But if you get really high tides, which are caused by climate changes, when they're trying to nest, their nest will get drowned out. So that's a bird that's very threatened by climate change and sea level rise. Yeah, that's something that we are concerned about because of this sea level rising could just destroy all of their nesting habitat. I mean, but destroy the actual nest and eggs. So then they'll have unsuccessful breeding and then you'll get population declines.
And just getting back to basics, if people do have a casual or, impromptu bird sighting, especially if there's a huge flock of birds like the common grackles, Is it wrong to feed them? Like, what should people...
There are mixed feelings about feeding birds. Some people think that bird feeding encourages them to not migrate to a better place. And then if the weather turns bad, they might not survive. I'm personally a bird feeder. In my yard in Brooklyn, I have many feeders and I have all kinds of different birds visiting there. And so I like feeding birds because I like watching birds. But, bird feeding, I mean, most people think it's harmless and in fact, maybe is helpful. But there is some people say that, especially hummingbird feeders, like if you put up hummingbird feeders, the hummingbirds stick around and feed on them rather than like migrating south.
Which might then, when it gets too
Yes,
cold.
if we get a cold snap and they're, and the flowers and they might not survive. And
Yeah. And just lastly, like, is there anything I didn't ask you that you think is important, anything particularly, that excites you in a place like New York City that you don't tend to think of as like the mecca of bird watching or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that New York City is actually a really great place to go bird watching. There's some fantastic places that actually, if you go out to the different parks, the cemeteries, the coastal areas, Jamaica Bay, that's a really great area. You can get, that's got great stuff. Out here in the Rockaways, out on Breezy Point, Fort Tilden, I love going there. Floyd Bennett Field here, Coney Island Creek, Prospect Park, Greenwood Cemetery.
And by great stuff, can you name a few of them?
Well, how about bald eagle, peregrine falcon, loons, grebes. Pretty much anything can turn up. Anything, from the Northeast can turn up in New York City.
And how long have you been doing this work again?
I have been in the museum for 32 years.
What are the most common questions you get in your role?
One of the commonest questions I get, from the public or from my bird watching group or the public, is, "What's your favorite bird?" And I don't have one, so
Still don't have it.
I don't really have a good answer for that. But
and are there any common misconceptions that you find yourself like most having to educate people either in those?
Well, I mean, the common misconception that you brought up is that those birds were crows. I mean, people say, "Oh, people think that grackles are crows," and they're really not crows, and they're not related to crows. So that's one thing that happens all the time. We do have crows here, but they're quite a bit bigger than grackles. And if you look at the grackles close up, they're not really black. They're actually like this iridescent, like purplish, greenish, bluish color. Actually quite beautiful. And they're members of the American blackbird family, like the same family as orioles and red-winged blackbirds and stuff like that.
And is there one thing that you wish members of the public would know about birds? Or
I think everybody should get some binoculars and go out and go bird watching.
After talking to experts like Sweet, I asked my colleague Daniel LaPlaza, a self-proclaimed level 1 birder, for tips. He recommended beginning birder books, binoculars, and made me realize how much I had left to learn.
I was sitting in Columbus Circle one day waiting for a friend, and a few birds had like collected, to eat some bird feeder or whatever it was.
What kind of birds?
It dawned on me. It dawned on me. I was like, what kind of birds are these? I see them all over the place. Like it was the small sparrows that I come to learn is like that are all over the city, the house sparrows. And I had realized, I was like, yeah, I see these all the time, yet it's fascinating to me that I have no idea what type of bird they are, right? There's another set of birds, the starlings, right? Also very popular. So it was at that moment I like searched it and I was like, this is what they are. I searched the way that, the coloring, and I kind of started off, I was like, well, interesting. Like the fact that I see these so often means that there are other birds here that are less common, which is what makes birding, I think, so exciting, is spotting something that is so rare and uncommon, right? And so what helped me, first of all, was downloading an app from the Audubon Society. It allows you, it's an encyclopedia that allows you to literally search features of a bird, and it'll tell you what bird it might be, right? With photos and, migration patterns. And the coolest part for me within that app is that it has different calls, like different bird calls. So then when I would hear anything or see anything that was different from what I knew to be common, it excited me.
What was the first bird you were able to recognize, whose call you were able to recognize?
I think it was a blue jay. So blue jays have these like really almost like nasty sounding, like almost caws. It's like, meh, meh, meh. Something
really?
Like that. It's like a squeaky, like nasally call. And that was one. I mean, blue jays aren't super uncommon, right? They're a little bit more common, but it was less common than what you see some of the sparrows and these starlings, right?
What do you think it is about? Is it just like, okay, we're a bunch of city people just like, oh, look, nature is in our midst, even though it has been the whole time? Like, what do you think it is that
I
that
think it's
crazy.
the break from the common, right? Like what is exotic, right? If you were to see this duck, it's like definition of exotic, whereas you have all these other mallards, these other ducks that are in Central Park, right? And the lakes, and you're like, that one is different, right? And I think it's the uniqueness, right? And the same goes for what we were saying about like hearing certain sounds that are different or distinct, right?
Do you notice a difference, or do people like, does your partner, like friends, like notice a difference in like when you started birding in terms of like some of these things like attention and awareness?
So it came up at a time when I was also practicing a lot of what would be, I guess, generally referred to as like mindfulness practices, right? Like that is meditations or like breathing techniques, or like reading a lot and trying to understand a lot about what does it mean to be mindful and present. Before any of this happened, I made a point to not listen to music in transit. Like I leave my headphones at home. And when I walk to the subway, or I'm going somewhere, or I'm taking a ride, using transit, I don't bring my headphones because it's like I want to know what's going on around me, right? That then now when you are walking and you hear something different, right? It's whether it be, a bird or, something happening in New York, right? I feel way more aware of it, right? It's an increased awareness, I think is what I mean to say, like practices of awareness. It's actually probably a reward for doing this hard work of practicing awareness, even before birding. Does that make sense? Where it's like it like isn't very much in line with the way I was trying to I don't know, be present with the world around me.
And then do you have any final tips? Like, would you sometimes, if you knew you were maybe in an area where you might find
Hmm.
when you might find some birds, is there like you're kind of looking somewhere like up in the trees and kind of seeing if something's off, a little bit different, like maybe, hey, maybe that nub over there is actually an owl? Or
Yeah,
is it
yeah,
more like you were saying where it's like you first usually hear them? Is it more like you prick your ears up and like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's I guess the first tip would be, it's gonna sound obvious, but stop, right? It's like, okay, kind of be present with where you are. You're hearing a sound and follow it, right? Like your mind has an amazing ability to pinpoint location based on sound, right? Like this is behind me, above me, next to me, and look within that area, right? Having that's when binoculars really helps, because it might be right in front of you, but because it's, too far away, you might not be able to see anything.
The binocular, you need to know what you need to zoom in when you're going to use the binoculars, right? So how do you know? So that at that point, like you kind of have zeroed in through using like other senses, and then you're
Yeah,
like,
yeah. So the tip there would be like, it's a lot harder to scan around, at least from my experience. Someone might tell you otherwise, but it's a lot harder to scan around when you're zoomed in, right? So think about it almost like you're looking for the general area first, and then you pull them up, right? Because you might be off completely if you're starting with binoculars, right? And then go back and forth, right? If you hear it, kind of search around, right? The other thing I would say is like patience. That's going to be huge in all of this. There's times when that's actually the beauty of some of these finds, is that you hear it, like people spend their lives looking for a certain type of bird, right? Or like, and then they see it in one moment, right? And it could just be the tail feather that's flown away, right? Like, but it exists, right?
and then do you find yourself going into kind of rabbit holes once you spot it, or something that you
Yeah, yeah. I think it's becomes a rabbit hole most often is when I see a bird and I don't know what it is. It's like, how do I find this one, right? And that's what's great about this app in particular, the Audubon one, is that it starts with, well, how big is it? What are the colors? What are the feathers look like, right? What did it sound like in terms of certain, descriptors of, it actually sound like a squawk versus a tin versus like whatever, right? And then it will narrow down within the database. And then that's always fun. When you see the photo, you're like, that's what it is, right? And it's to your point, right? It's like, oh, I thought this was a crow, and it actually turns out that it was a grackle, or it's a raven, or whatever, some black bird, right? Or it's actually, I thought it was a different bird, but it's actually a female or a male of a bird that actually I see all the time, and I just haven't seen that kind. That's always exciting.
Yeah.
If you want to get started on your own birding journey, check out our show notes. We've included links to NYC Parks, urban rangers, and local birders, the NYC chapter of the Audubon Society, and others, including women, LGBTQIA+, and BIPOC-centered ones.
like the Feminist Bird Club, Latino Outdoors NYC, and Outdoor Afro NYC. You can also discover one of the largest collections of bird specimens in the world in our own backyard at the American Museum of Natural History's Department of Ornithology. Happy birding! And that's all for today. Thanks for listening and thanks for supporting us as we do our best to support our community. We couldn't do it without you. For more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at epicenter-nyc.com. Our intro music is All the Pretty Horses by Karavika. You can find more of their music on their website, linked to in our podcast description.